So I'll say welcome again, week 10, English 372, last bit of Evaristo, headed into the last little final few things, activities of the term, kind of exciting. So what I thought I'd do first today is talk just a little bit about course business, and then take a look in particular at the beginning of the after party section of Evaristo and kind of talk us through maybe kind of going back and picking up a few things, some connections, some theoretical orientations that we might find useful with this text. And then, yeah, that's kind of that's my plan. Does anybody have questions before we start? No worries, Cassandra. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I had a question about the final. I couldn't remember what you said it was, what kind of final it would be for Girl, Woman, Other. So could you maybe?
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess I'm still thinking a little bit about what the final will be. It'll definitely be an essay. So there's no memorization, no multiple choice test, that kind of thing. It will deal with the novel we've been working on. I think one way I might handle it as a response to the book reviews that we're going to look at for Thursday. So, and it may also ask you to kind of reach back for prior British literature and make some connections. So, oh yeah, thanks, Jill. Yeah. So I'll have a prompt for you by Thursday. I just have been kind of letting the novel stew a little bit in my head before I frame anything up. But that's kind of where we're headed.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I don't, to Jill's comment about whether the after party is a good chapter, I guess I'm picking it because there's some things I want to say about it, or I want us to kind of explore about it, particularly having to do with the way that a party in a novel like tends to bring all of the characters or many of them together. And in particular, this novel allows a lot of them to rub up against each other. So I guess I want to just focus on that. Yeah, I thought I really enjoyed the Grace section too, Cassandra. And I have to say, I don't know, there was just something about the way all these different women's lives coalesced that I really enjoyed. And I liked the fact that the Grace chapter went back so far in time. Like I think it's is it the oldest? I think it's the oldest section historically. So that was really interesting. And we can, if you want to talk about that stuff, we can. I'm perfectly happy to do that. Okay, so before we get into Evaristo, let me just touch base with you about a couple things. So let me get my back door set up properly here. Okay, I just want to share my screen. I'm going into the week 10 module. And I just want to point out that there are links to 3 book reviews here. And I'd like to use those at our next class meeting as a springboard into talking further about the novel. So if you wouldn't mind having a look at those sometime between now and Thursday, that would be awesome. The other thing I want to mention is I'm grateful most of you have been able to post a draft to the discussion board. Thank you for doing that. And I see and a lot of you are already engaged in providing one another feedback. So what's happening on my end is that I'm about halfway done with the Shakespeare class paper twos. And so as soon as I'm done with those today, I'll shift to our class and get feedback to you. So I expect to have feedback on your drafts by tomorrow at the latest. So I'd like to kind of keep us on the schedule that we're on. I think I put in the syllabus for the paper to be due Friday. It may be more realistic for it to be due Sunday. So I guess I'm just going to invite you to take that deadline as you need to. You have other work that you're working on, other things that are impinging on your, work time for this class. So just wait for me. Once you have my feedback, take the time you need to do a revision, get it turned in. The earlier the better, because I'll be scoring things and I kind of want you to be able to see how things are adding up so that if there's additional work that you'd like to do, you can do it. That's kind of how I run the end of the term. Those of you that haven't worked with me before, I grade as fast as I can. I grade my butt off during finals week and try to get the scores caught up so you can see. And then if you want to turn in additional work sometime between, between now and the end of finals week, that would be great. My grades are due the Monday of spring break. And I pretty much grade steadily up until like the last minute and sometimes beyond the last minute. So feel free to continue to turn stuff in. If we run into a situation where the timing isn't working for you, just get in contact with me. I'm happy to talk with you about it. And I don't really, I'm just not very deadline oriented. So even after I've turned my grades in, I sometimes go back and do grade changes. So again, I guess don't feel like you can't do it because there's a deadline or stressed out about the deadline. Just stick to the work, keep your nose to the grindstone, get it done when you can get it done, and I'll get it graded. So that's kind of the plan. Are there any questions about that? Yeah, you might think I'm doing it just to be popular, but actually, I think my lack of deadline orientation is really problematic for students. Sorry, I think if I were stricter, you would smash the work in however it needed to be, but I've tried. Over my 25 plus years of teaching, I've tried to be strict about deadlines and I simply can't do it. So, oh, go on. Oh, go on. You're too kind. Yeah, so maybe the other thing I should mention is there's course evaluations to do this week. So if you want to like turn some of that into where the rubber meets the road, feel free. One thing, I'm blushing, can you see? One thing I'll mention about course evaluations that's really important for students to know, and I say it every time we hit week 10, is that if a course has too few students responding, the data that they provide is not useful to the university because like if there's 10 students and only 2 provide feedback, there's not enough of an aggregate to indicate the quality of a class. So what needs to happen is most of the students in a class need to do the evaluation so that then there's the sense that there's a critical mass. Then you can say, okay, the evaluations are about 75% positive, they're about 50% positive, they're 99% positive. And if that's only 2 people, it means nothing, right? So it's really, really important for you to provide feedback in all your classes so that students' voices get heard, right? And I think sometimes it's the classes that have the least feedback where maybe students are feeling disengaged, where the feedback is the most important. So anyway, I give extra credit for completing the course evaluation. In the week 10 module, there's a link to it's like a little form that just says, yes, I did it, no, I didn't. And like, yes is the right answer, right? That's how you get the credit. So please go in and let me know that you did the course evaluation. I don't have access to the comments until at least a week after my grades are due. They all come to me without names attached. So just know that you should feel free to be honest. And I appreciate getting the feedback from you that helps me make my teaching better. So great, great, great. Okay, so, well, let me talk with you a little bit about the after party, and then let's go and back and pick up Hattie and Grace, and we can talk about them. But I'll get us started just by taking a look at, this is page 405. It's right at the beginning of the after party. For folks who are working with a Kindle, you may have a different page number, but it should be relatively easy to find. And I want to just run us through the kind of gamut of ways in which interpretation can happen. So I'm just taking a big step back, thinking about some of the things we've been doing throughout the course by way of literary analysis, and revisiting this little beginning of this section. So again, I think I'm just going to read it so that we have a shared understanding of what's going on there. So this is the first part of the after party. I'm just going to read like maybe a page of the text. Roland is the first to triple moi ama when she makes her grande entree to the after party of the last Amazon of Dahomey in the lobby of the theater. A crescendo of chattering voices and clinking Prosecco glasses stilled, following by rapturous applause and bravo, ama, bravo. She looks simply spectacular in a figure-hugging wraparound dress that shows off her toned arms, tiny waist, and the Mamadou hips that have emerged in the past few years. Although she's gone and ruined the effect by wearing silver trainers, ever the rebellious teenager at heart, or rather, au cœur. My French is so bad, au cœur. The play was simply wonderful, wonderful, Roland effuses, which is all she ever wants to hear, which is all he ever wants to hear, which is all anyone ever wants to hear. 5-star review has already been uploaded online from one usually savage pit bull of a critic who's been uncharacteristically gushing. Astonishing, moving, controversial, original. Rightly so, the production is indeed deserving of the highest praise and a far cry from the agit-prop rants of Ama's early theater career. Although the mother of his only child, writer and director and dear, dear friend could have made her name where it mattered a long time ago, if she'd taken his advice and directed a few multi-culti Shakespeares, Greek tragedies and other classics, instead of writing plays about Black women which will never have popular appeal, simply because the majority of the majority sees the majority of les négresses as separate to themselves, an embodiment of otherness. Roland decided long ago to align himself with establishment, which is why he's a winner and a household name among the educated classes where it counts. Ama, on the other hand, has waited 3 decades before being allowed in through the front door. Although she hasn't exactly been hammering on the castle walls for the duration. In truth, Girlfriend spent much of her early career slinging rocks at it. All right, so I want to kind of run this little passage through the different approaches we could use in literary analysis, the first of which and the foundation of which is textual analysis. And one thing that is interesting to me about what Evaristo is doing stylistically is not only the way she's using sort of white space in a poetic way for emphasis on the page, but also the way she's moving in and out of the consciousnesses of these multiple characters. So I guess I just want to ask you, so what perspective do we have here? How would you describe it? Whose is it?
I was kind of wondering the same thing, and I'm wondering if maybe it's just a removed perspective, a neutral one.
Okay, so maybe like a narrator. So the narrator could be describing Roland and Roland's experience. Maybe it's an omniscient narrator who knows everything about him and is revealing certain aspects of his experience this evening. Is it first or third person?
Both sometimes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so I think you're right. And I think I'm gonna say, yeah, I think we're in Roland's mental space here. But let's look at how the narrative does this, right? So we are in third person by naming Roland, unless Roland is thinking about himself in the third person, which happens sometimes. I do it sometimes myself. So, talking to myself in the third person makes me a little worried. Okay, so of myself to myself. So Roland is the first to triple moi ama, right? So that could be an objective narrator looking at Roland from the outside and watching what he's doing when he greets Amma. What might cue us in that maybe this is Roland after the word Roland, that maybe we've moved into Roland's head?
I think the French tips us off immediately. None of the other characters, to my recollection, used French words, and it goes right along with Roland putting on a mask of he's just pretentious.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're British, using a French phrase, the British and the French have been at it with each other for, centuries, right? So he's using this elitist language in his own head. I do that, right? I use my French phrases. Yeah, no. Right, yeah, so that's one. And I think too, his reaction that where Cassandra says his reaction to Amma, right? That this isn't a narrator reporting objectively on Amma, right? This is Roland thinking she looks great, right? And here's what she's wearing, and here's what makes it great. And he's constantly in his mind, and probably we all do this too, right? He's giving something and then taking it back, right? So he says, she looks simply spectacular, although, right? She's gone and ruined the effect. She's wearing sneakers with this beautiful wraparound thing that she's got on. So, his own mental space, he's reaching out and critiquing, constantly sort of amending his own thought process. Yeah, what are some other ways that we see through his perspective in this sequence?
I guess the word girlfriend kind of catches my eye. Although she hasn't exactly been hammering on the castle walls for the duration, in truth, girlfriend spent much of her early career singing rocks at it. So there's like a title that he gives to her, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's using a kind of English that's common. That's part of Black English, right? So he's using a language that's like most of the rest of his mental language is it's either French or it's relatively standard elitist English, right? But he shifts in that moment into, I don't know, or you could, another way to look at it is that I'm hearing that voice also from some of my gay friends, right, who might call me girlfriend. So there's this interesting shift in the I want to say the syntax, the diction, that indicates a perspective, and particularly his perspective. Yes, and Alexa, that's right. So here we have Roland. He doesn't get a section named after him. He does appear, I think, in the Yaz section for a bit, and I can't remember whether we get into his consciousness there, but we are in his consciousness here for sure. Yeah. And we can see he's thinking, he's arguing with himself about Amma's career. He has an opinion on it. He has an opinion on this play. He cares about the 5-star review, right? That's really important to him. It's part of what it means to have made it in this, you know, traditionally white culture. Yeah, good. Okay, I think watching the way the narrative moves into a mind, shows us the interior life of the mind, and then transfers into another mind, moves into it, shows us the interior, is really fascinating. It's like, and I'm drawing on lots of scholarship that I've done on Virginia Woolf, who specializes in stream of consciousness. And a metaphor that she likes to use about the way life is that it's like a river and we're bubbles, right? We're bubbles in the stream. And you can think about our little heads floating along in this river, and we bump into each other, we encounter each other. The water flows into and out of us. I guess maybe that's not scientifically true of bubbles, but that's how I'm picturing it, right? That there's the space, mental space, and all of the sensory information of the world around us, it's permeable, right? That stuff moves in and out. We react to it. Some of it we ignore. And then we really only have connection with others through that sort of permeable membrane, right? We're never really truly able to get connected, except maybe through something like this where we're reading and we're sort of inhabiting a character. But when we're dealing with real people, we're always outside. So this kind of narration is a really interesting way to actually make connections with other people, with these fictional characters, and particularly when the narrative invites us in. So I think it's worth looking at the stylistic technique in this novel related to that. Okay, I want to do a second move, which is a step backward. So obviously text-based analysis is the foundation of literary study. Another direction, right, Cassandra, thank you. Yes, I think the way that the characters modify not only their own thinking as we see their thoughts, but they kind of bump up against the assumptions of each other. They're critical of each other in interesting ways, which means that the story is always kind of rewriting itself, which I like. Very interesting.
Okay. I was thinking about that in relation. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
I was thinking about that in relation to the title, because at first I was thinking girl, woman, other. It was just very straightforward, and that Morgan was probably other. But that use of other could relate in other ways. We could be talking about Roland and Sylvester, or we could be talking about the way that each character sees one another as the other, as different, especially as we talk about their different cultures and marginalities. So I think that could be another layer there. And from Roland's eyes, or from any of the male characters' eyes, the women, girls, non-binary character would all be other to them as well.
Well said. Yes. I mean, so on one level, we can only be other to each other individually. And I love that. I love that idea that maybe the novel's reaching for that interiority that we all have, and bringing it into a public space. And I do think that when with the words girl, woman, other, we're sort of invited to think about sexuality. It just seems like a knee-jerk reaction. But we might be thinking also, like you said, the ways in which culturally or sociologically we're othered that have to do with power, right? So if you think about the categories of power, the categories that we use for, legally to check for discrimination have to do with race, class, gender, religion, age, ability. And so the ways in which we ourselves are inside the norm and participate in the norm, and the ways in which we are outside the norm. And I like the way this novel really tries to interrogate those borders, and that even when we find ourselves inside a norm, the characters are also, critical in interesting ways, or they end up being a little more complicated because they don't sort of toe the line that you might expect with that particular kind of identification. So so again, sort of makes that boundary between the norm and the other a little more permeable. Yeah, good. Well, so the second direction, and so I'm going to come back to that idea. But the second direction I want to go is the direction that my English teacher back in the 80s often went, which is into biography, right? So it's a particular theoretical assumption that biography matters. And let me, again, just get my backside of this ready. So I'm going to revisit Evaristo's biography, right? So, and you may notice some similarities between her biography and the lives of her characters. She's the fourth of 8 children. She was born in Southeast London. She comes from English, Irish, German on one side of her family and Nigerian and Brazilian on the other. Her father was a welder and a labor counselor. And I assume labor meaning the Labor Party, right? So he was politically active on the liberal side of the spectrum. Mother was a school teacher, right? And she went to a girls' grammar school. I'm not sure if that's a private or public school. And then she went on to speech and drama college, on to the University of London, earned a PhD, and she was involved in Greenwich Young People's Theatre. So you can see again some strands of the author's biography. Also, she's married to a man. Again, assumption, she's married to a husband. So there's, again, we have a little bit of information about her life, and we had been talking maybe last week about who has the right to write about different people, right? And she is coming definitely from an area of expertise in her background, writing about things she knows, but she's also reaching beyond her own expertise to capture these characters. And whether she does it well or not may depend partly on her own background and the limitations of her background. Does anybody have thoughts about that in connection particularly to the Roland section we just looked at? Okay, great. So a third direction we can go is, so we've talked about text, we've talked about author. Lots of times we assume that we have to reach after what the author intended. But if we move into the reader area of our rhetorical triangle, where a text is being produced by an author for readership, the reader also has quite a lot of power over the meaning of the text. And one could argue that the only meaning that readers can have in relation to a text is their own. So again, because we're locked in our bubbles. So think a little bit about our own biography, perhaps our own intersectionality in terms of categories of power, race, class, gender, age, ability, etc. Does it change the meaning, whatever the author might have intended, if the person reading is different? So are there places where this particular novel caught your interest or didn't catch your interest based on your own background?
I guess what stuck out to me a lot was the parts where, such as the older women immigrating, those are the ones that I guess resonated with me the most. Learning about their difficult backgrounds and what they had to go through to come here or to London. And my life has been very easy in comparison.
So there's a contrast between readers' experience and the experience of the characters that may create interest, like a discovering a new people, new territory.
Yeah.
That's definitely my experience, right? I feel like, again, I've had a pretty cushy life, cushy middle-class life. Yeah, thanks, Cassandra. Yes. And I think, absolutely, we can make connections with characters who experience loss based on our own experiences. And just as an example, I love the depiction of Hattie as this 93-year-old with her family gathered around her who maybe don't care as much about her as they think they do. And, having my mom suffered from Alzheimer's for 7 years and passed away a few years ago. And so when I was thinking about Hattie, I was kind of thinking about my own mother and the way in which she inhabited space, family space, when she was not really processing what was happening around her. Right? Yeah.
The adoption stories were really interesting to me. My kiddo is adopted, and particularly Penelope's parents and the way that they handled that revelation was infuriating to me. Our child never, we never sat down and said you're adopted. They always knew, and as they got older and were able to process more, then there was more information given. And even with the assurances that their birth mom loved them and connection there and letters and such, there's still, I think most adult adoptees have some abandonment issues and feel a lot of grief around that, no matter how secure their family relationship became or ended up being. And so just seeing that in Penelope was really, it made me really angry at those characters, but I also questioned how much research or how well the author knew, because I think it can also be an easy, like, oh, I'm sure I know what that feels like, or I can imagine that and just write that in. And it didn't ring fully true to me either.
Mm-hmm. Which was another comment we were saying about the Megan Morgan section, not quite ringing true. Yeah, and this is the power of imagination, to inhabit the lives of people who aren't us. But it's also the limitation of imagination, and maybe the source or the inspiration or the need for research as part of the creative process. When I work with students on their capstones with creative writers, especially, I keep trying to say, no, actually, creative writers do quite a lot of research. They must, because we don't inhabit, the only life we know is our own, and even what we know about that life is limited to our perspective at the time. So I don't even know very much about where I grew up just because I lived there. I know all the little wrinkles of the landscape in which I grew up, but I don't know all the other things about it, its history, its cultures. And it really, I think research becomes a necessity when trying to build sympathetic characters, absolutely.
Well, I would say, along with that research, there's been a lot of debate over the past few years in children's publishing about who has the right to tell what story, and doing that research. And one of the components to this debate is using expert readers or sensitivity readers to read through and be able to give you more insight into what. So these are readers from the background or culture or marginalization or whatever it is that you're writing that live that experience, and then can come in and say, I can see that you've done your research really well on paper, but this phrase here is offensive, or no one in our community would say something like that. And so it can be really helpful as in improving your craft and in improving the draft, but it's also been seen as very controversial in some circles as well, as though you almost need to get a stamp of approval, or, you know, and so there's been a lot of debate about that over the last few years. And I think a lot of that came up in my mind as I was reading this as well. Like, you know, when I read the interview from her, and she was saying you can write anyone and anything, that's what we're writers. And in my mind, I was filling in the blanks, but you can't discount the consequences that might come when you get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. And the learning that would come from having someone show you the places where the blind spots that we all have, because we're living in our own bubbles. I worked last summer with the poet Frank X. Walker. He published, he's been doing quite a lot of poetry that's kind of like historical fiction. It's based on real people's experiences. And he wrote a collection of poems that was about the slave that went on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And then while he was out in the world getting feedback on that book, he had a lot of feedback from Native American folks who really wanted him to include more Native American material. And he had gravitated toward the slave member of the party because his ethnic origins were aligned. And he ended up writing a second collection that was much more diverse, using the voices of lots of people who encountered or were part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it's interesting, as an African American man, was that more permissible than it would have been for a white person to attempt to do that kind of speaking for others, bringing the characters to life? I think it's a very sensitive area right now, definitely. And one would hope that with imagination you could surmount those barriers, but they're very real barriers and important. So, okay, great. Well, I want to do one other thing. I want to talk just briefly about some other angles we could take on this novel. Well, obviously, we can think through the theory of gender and sexuality. This is an easy novel to do that with. We can think through the theories associated with race and ethnicity and power. We can also think through issues of nationality and location. So one political issue that arises for people out here in Eastern Oregon is that we're out here in the middle of the nowhere, and we don't have a lot of voice on the west side of the state. And so there's sometimes a rural-urban divide that happens in terms of power issues. We can see some of that happening potentially with the rural-urban kinds of dynamics that happen in this book that might be interesting to work with. Or the Britain-America dynamic that sometimes comes up, associated particularly with Dominique. Or the Britain former colony dynamics that happen also, where all of these people are coming from different places. And I think Sarah, the child of, can't remember, I need Alexa in her chart, ends up in Australia, which is still a Commonwealth nation. So there's a lot of coverage of different geographical locations and different political being empowered and disempowered based on that. Two other issues to consider might be, or maybe three. We could also look at class. There's a lot of discussion of capitalism and wealth. Definitely people who don't have wealth are seeking to get it, and who could critique them for that? But once you have it, what do you do with it? How do you live with it? How do you understand the people around you who don't have it? There's a lot of different discourse associated with money in this book that's interesting to look at. Obviously, because we're inhabiting psychological spaces, psychoanalytic theory might be useful for thinking about this book. And lastly, history, historical context. It's sometimes hard to imagine that, maybe it's easier for younger people to do this, I don't know. But that this book, let's see, this book was published in 2019. That is now history, right? In fact, the beginning of this class is now history. So it's sometimes hard to imagine that the historical moment in such a contemporary work might be important. But thanks Heidi, Penelope's daughter, Sarah's Penelope's daughter, okay. But even the Brexit vote that happened not long ago has had big historical impact. You know, it's this impact of this choice on the pullout of Britain from the European Union. And so what does the historical moment help us understand about the novel? And then why and how might this novel fit in with the sort of literary history that it's part of? And if we think back to where we started this term with the Romantics, right, and this sort of romantic idea of nature, the Gothic, and I always think, well, the Gothic is so interesting because it's actually not about like scary things outside so much as it is about scary things inside. So that trend, we might think back to, and particularly I'm thinking about Jekyll and Hyde with regard to that as well, but also the sort of urban landscape of London that appears in other literature. We might think also toward the poetry of revolution that occurs in William Butler Yeats's Irish poems. And think about the way in which this novel participates in that trajectory of other works. I just want to touch very briefly on one, and then we'll take the last 5 minutes of class to maybe go back to Hattie and Grace and see if there's stuff we want to say about them. But this book, normally I teach Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway in this class, and that novel is entirely included in your textbook. But just because I wanted to teach this book, I kicked Virginia Woolf out of my lineup. I try to teach a novel or novelish length work by a man, a novelish length work by a woman. And so often I teach Dracula and Mrs. Dalloway. So I put this book into the lineup and we did Jekyll and Hyde instead of Dracula. Anyway, so I have been thinking a lot about Mrs. Dalloway, and Mrs. Dalloway is a novel that occurs within a 24-hour period. It's set in London, and it leads up to a party at the end. Mrs. Dalloway throws a party, but it follows multiple characters throughout the day as they make their way toward this sort of pinnacle moment at the end of the book. And I guess for me, I'm kind of reading this book, the party in this book, against that one. And it's really interesting to me that that novel ends with I think it's the sentence, "There she was," like Mrs. Dalloway just appeared at the top of the staircase, right? And that's the ending. It's almost as if there was all this multiple stuff that happened throughout the day, and it just narrowed into this moment where Mrs. Dalloway was fully present at her party. It's really interesting to me that this novel doesn't collect it. It doesn't really gather everything up into a nice, neat package and hand it to you the way that Woolf's novel does. And I want to keep thinking about what makes that different, how that might be important, particularly since we have an epilogue. Yeah. I love teaching books I haven't read. It's like I get so busy that I don't read a lot, and I have to assign myself these books to get them done. And I'm really glad I did. They're wonderful, and I love the discovery process of reading. And just side note, I taught God of Small Things years ago in that way, and there's a pretty significant sexual encounter in that book that was unexpected for all involved. So I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it was interesting. It's sometimes causes interesting discussions when you're just like, oh my gosh, did you realize that just happened? What just happened? Anyway, so yeah, so I think that as readers, we're also reading anything new against our understanding of that literary history that we're carrying forward. And I think that's a really important part of why we study literature, because there's a kind of an amazing heritage and a set of voices that we absorb and carry out into our daily lives. All right, so let's go on back. So I think I've stopped blah blah blahing to you. Let's go back and think a little bit about Hattie and Grace. And maybe, I don't know, would everybody maybe type in something in the chat about one of these sections, something you noticed? Oh, sorry, Landry. Yeah, something about either Hattie or Grace, those sections, something you noticed about those sections. Yeah, I agree. So again, I'm just gonna maybe pull up some of these things people are saying. The language used in the Hattie section varied a lot more than that of the other women. That's interesting. And it might be good to go back and take a look at a section of the language to see. And I agree, Grace's depression, her particularly after postpartum depression, right? So finally she has a baby that's alive and needs her and she can't respond. Really, really painful. Yeah, and my post, I feel like I wanted to look up the spelling of Abyssinian. I think I've got it wrong. Sorry that if I've spelled it incorrectly. It just is a really, it's an interesting term, and maybe it's kind of Orientalist in the sense that it's an old-fashioned sort of colonial name for an area of geography. But it sounds kind of poetic to say that, oh, my dad came from Abyssinia, right? Just sounds like a fairy tale. Yeah. Oh, and so maybe, Megan, we won't have time today to look at that, but maybe we can come back and look at it on Thursday, page 345.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, I think we should maybe circle back to that so we can look at it with a little more time to talk. Good. Yeah, anything else? Grace was Hattie's mother. Hattie was important to Megan Morgan and Penelope. So it was all, and I guess I'm trying to delay talking about the epilogue till maybe Thursday because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who's still reading. But it was interesting, and I don't know what I think about the sort of ancestry DNA stuff that appears at the end. But I'd love to talk about that some more on Thursday. Yeah. Yeah, Heidi says the way the text counted the days and months the baby had lived. Yeah, totally built suspense, but it totally felt like something that was the mother was doing, right? That, and I had my daughter as an older parent, and I definitely went through periods of time where I was like, I don't know if this baby's gonna actually make it into the world. And I know what that feels like. So, okay. So we'll reconvene on Thursday. Thursday will be our last class meeting. We don't have any meetings during finals week. I will have the final exam prompt ready for you by then. Okay, yeah, Alexa, ASCOU is working with President Insco to do a teacher appreciation award. Eventually students and staff should be able to submit nominees. Be on the lookout for an email. Yeah, I agree about Lily too. Wow. Yeah, great. Did Alexa win something? Am I just like not paying attention properly?
She's the student body, or like the president of the ASCOU, right?
Alexa, really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. I normally have that on my radar and I didn't even notice. So I'm so glad for you. You've been doing such good work this year. I can tell why people wanted you to keep going in a more powerful role. Great, great. I lost my train of thought completely. I'm so excited. Okay, so final exam will be, I'll have that ready for you Thursday. We'll talk through it. We'll talk about the end of the novel. We'll talk about the book reviews of the novel, and then we'll go off happily into the world to finish everything that we started. Yeah, hopefully as quickly as possible. So yeah, be on the lookout for feedback from me on your drafts today and tomorrow. All right, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.